This will be all of the Eon films, and only one of the unofficial ones. There's probably a ton of other James Bond ripoffs that just they're not being included. You know, Operation Kid Brothers starring Neil Connery, not on the list for obvious reasons. This is just 25 James Bond films ranked. I rewatched these rather recently, so most of them are pretty fresh in my mind. Most of them. I will point out, though, I watched these in a very weird order because finished reading the Ian Fleming books. I'd read some of them, but I decided to read the rest of them. One of my next video projects is I'm going to be comparing the Fleming books to the movies. That will not be out for quite a while. I don't even know when this video will be out, or how edited the fucking thing will have to be, but anyway. But yeah, I decided to watch them in the order of the Fleming books, so that might have influenced my opinion on some of these. I have no idea. You know, because I'd seen all these movies before. I've seen these movies multiple times. I know what they are, but I'll quit stalling. I'll quit fucking stalling. I'll just get to the video. This is DrenZaria, Maverick DrenZaria, ranking all of the James Bond films. This one comes in dead last for the first time, because I've done rankings of the James Bond movies, you know, like, I haven't posted a video about although my earlier reviews of the James Bond movies I reviewed some of them pretty early on this channel. Those were edited out of a longer video where I ranked all of them. That ranking is completely different from the one I have now. Almost completely different. That was almost 4 years ago. That was like 3 years ago when I made that video, which I never released because it was too long. This is the first time this one has been at the very bottom. The very first time. So congratulations for being the very worst Bond movie, Quantum of Solace. Why is this at number 25? I'll tell you why. For one thing, Daniel Craig is not playing James Bond in this. He is basically just... You could take any generic action hero, whatever, from the 2000s, stick him in this movie, and it wouldn't change a goddamn thing. He just goes around, just shoots bad guys. That's about it. I think Daniel Craig's a good actor. This movie just gives him nothing to work with. The villains are completely forgettable. I honestly did not know who the henchman was until like the second or third time I saw this. Like, I didn't even know there was a henchman in this, or who he was. He was this guy with weird hair that they called Elvis, and I'm like, who the fuck is that? Villain's just boring, forgettable, even with like most of the other James Bond movies, even most of the bad ones. I remember the villain. I remember who the villain is. I remember what his plot is. With this, I forgot. I forgot. It involved water or something. And it's not even the plot's convoluted. It's just that it's such a boring movie. It's so forgettable and like generic that it's hard to even remember, which is a bad sign. The writing's just a mess. The action scenes are just horribly edited. Just that quick cut, like 4 shots per second or something that just, oh god, it's hard to review this movie because there's almost nothing to talk about. It's just so forgettable, so bland, so boring that there's like multiple action scenes, but they're just all boring and forgettable and like just could have taken them from any action movie from around that time, 2008, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And the film is, another thing I'd like to note, this is the shortest James Bond film. 106 minutes. This is the shortest James Bond film, but it feels longer. This feels like it's over 2.5 hours. This feels longer. It is just, oh my god. Doesn't feel like a Bond movie. It's boring. It's forgettable. Terrible movie. It's supposed to continue the plot line of Casino Royale. It's supposed to tie everything up. Tell us, like, who Mr. White is, who he's working for, all that. Tell us what Quantum is. And we never learn that. We never do. Not in this movie, anyway. We don't learn that until, like, 2 movies later. And it's pointless, basically. It's completely pointless. If you watch this, then watch Skyfall, then Spectre, you'll have missed nothing from this movie. Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing!
I guess that's another thing. It's just a completely pointless film. It's terrible. It's just... There's just nothing here to talk about. There's nothing here to talk about. I kind of like the part at the end with the building on fire. That's at least sort of memorable. But other than that, the movie is just a piece of shit. Yeah. I'm done talking about this piece of shit. I'm done. Or I'm going to just get really fucking mad. But anyway, now I have to talk about another piece of shit. I did not want to do this. The reason I don't want to put this solo is because it stars my favorite James Bond, Sean Connery. But this movie sucks. This movie fucking sucks. And that is Diamonds Are Forever. One of only 2 Bond movies I own on Blu-ray. Bob only knows why. Like Quantum of Solace, this one tries, sort of, to be a direct sequel to the previous film. In Quantum of Solace's case, it was Casino Royale. In the case of Diamonds Are Forever, it was Our Majesty's Secret Service, supposed to resolve the plot involving Blofeld, who is James Bond's arch nemesis throughout multiple movies. And I'll admit, one of the best parts of the movie is the opening, where James Bond is just beating the shit out of people, trying to find Blofeld. He's like going, where is Ernst Stavro Blofeld? Just punching people. I wish there'd been more of that. He kills Blofeld because Blofeld's like got these lookalikes. He kills one of the lookalikes in the opening. They made Blofeld, James Bond's arch nemesis, into a complete joke in this film. He's not menacing at all. He's not threatening. He's just silly and huge step down from guys like Donald Pleasance and Telly Savalas. And there's just no resolution to the plot of the previous film. Because James Bond, he's like supposed to be out for revenge against Blofeld. Later in the film, they're just like talking to each other like they're old friends or some shit. They just do nothing with it. But on top of insulting one of the best Bond villains, the movie's just fucking awful. This is when the Bond movies started to go into the more cartoony, silly era. You got a ridiculous villain plot. Blofeld, like, he has this satellite that he builds out of, like, diamonds or some shit. And because the first half of the movie, it involves, like, diamond smuggling. But then you end up finding out, like, the twist is that Blofeld's still alive and that he's building this satellite using the diamonds. I wouldn't mind the plot so much, but the movie's just so damn boring. And surprisingly convoluted. I don't mind convoluted plots in a Bond movie, but at least make it interesting. And this movie's not interesting. There's very little action scenes, and the ones that are in there, like, okay, there's a few good fight scenes at the beginning of the movie. he somehow finds this set of, like, the moon in the middle of the desert and steals, like, a moon buggy and drives around to that in the desert. You would think that would at least be interesting, but it's just really slow and boring. And you can also tell that they really did not put much money into this because they offered Sean Connery a huge paycheck to return. Because the film looks cheap and dated. There's like very few sets or set pieces where you're just going, oh yeah, you can see where the money went. With most of the other James Bond movies, even some of the really bad ones, I can at least see where the money went. But this one, they just cheaped out, and it's obvious. But again, I wouldn't mind so much if the movie wasn't boring. Which this movie's boring. I don't care for the story. I just don't like this movie. I don't like this movie. I don't want to talk about it. That's the thing. There's a convoluted plot, very little action scenes, terrible villains for the most part. Winton Kidd, they're like these gay assassins that start off darkly comical and interesting, but as the movie goes along, they just get more and more incompetent in their attempts to kill James Bond, that they're just not menacing, not intimidating or anything. Also, don't set a James Bond movie in Las Vegas, ever. Don't. Just don't. My fucking God. I want my James Bond movies to have exotic locations. Setting it in Vegas in the 70s, fuck that. It makes me really sad that for a while, this was the last James Bond film that starred Sean Connery. This movie sucks. This movie fucking sucks. It was really miserable to sit through this. I wish they'd made it a revenge film against Blofeld. That would have been interesting, but instead we got this film, which just made Blofeld into a complete joke. The Man with the Golden Gun. Probably gonna notice I'm not a huge fan of Roger Moore. I mean, I like him as an actor, but I just don't buy him as a spy. I'm sorry, I don't buy him as a spy, let alone James Bond. And this is easily my least favorite of his films. You know, rewatching him, this was the worst. This was easily the worst. And it has a lot of the same problems I have with Diamonds Are Forever, in that it looks cheap, it's boring, there's very few action scenes, very few interesting ones too. Like, the film just looks rushed. It looks rushed. Like, there's very few set pieces in this, and the film didn't do as well as they hoped at the box office, and actually, it was very close to being the last James Bond film. Very close. We would have just had 9. The reason why this is above the other two is because I do like the villain in this. I really like Scaramanga. I think Christopher Lee is a great actor, and I like the idea of having an assassin that could possibly kill James Bond. But the big problem with this one is Roger Moore. Well, one of the big problems. I find him boring in this. He is nowhere near as interesting or as cool as Scaramanga is in this, which, when the villain is a lot cooler than Bond is, that is a huge problem. You have to have them on about the same level. You have to have a good James Bond and a good villain, and this one didn't have a good Bond. I'm sorry. One of Roger Moore's worst performances as Bond. Most of the movie's just him being a prick, honestly. He just, he goes around making dumb jokes and being a dick to people. I mean, I wouldn't mind this if it was done well, maybe. I don't know. But Roger Moore, just definitely not the right actor for this movie. The best action scenes in this are just really lame car chases, which mostly are excuses to make jokes rather than showcase huge stunts. There is that part where the car flips, but they ruin it by putting a sound effect over it. There's a karate scene in the middle of the film for no reason at all, other than to just capitalize on kung fu movies, were popular at the time, Bruce Lee. Instead of being an homage to Bruce Lee movies, it just ends up being more insulting and desperate, like they were running out of ideas and had to, chase trends at the time, which is a problem I have with the early Roger Moore Bond films. I don't like the supporting cast in this, I especially don't like the character of Goodnight, who is just a complete idiot. She's supposed to be a rookie agent, but how she even managed to get that position is beyond me. Because she just spends the entire movie messing things up, screwing things up. Honestly, Inspector Clouseau would be more suitable for that job. And Sheriff Pepper, fuck Sheriff Pepper. I never liked that character. I don't like that they brought him back. I found him annoying in this. There's no reason for this racist Louisiana sheriff to be in Thailand. The attempts at humor in this are just juvenile. I'm kind of mixed on Nick Nack. I don't mind the idea or the character, although I didn't need that final scene of him fighting Bond. That was just silly. It has a great plot. James Bond has to go against this assassin, but it's a huge letdown, When they finally do get to the final duel between Bond and Scaramanga, it's anticlimactic, it's really unsatisfying, just nowhere near as epic or suspenseful as it should be. And Scaramanga, he just completely overshadows him. Because Christopher Lee, for one thing, is a way better actor than Roger Moore. It's a good idea, the execution is complete shit. Some people off. It might. Number 22 is Live and Let Die. I used to like this one. This used to be one of my favorite ones, starring Roger Moore. This film aged really badly. This has easily the best songs, the best James Bond theme song, great song. But rewatching this film, it didn't do it for me. I was surprisingly really bored during it, and I was trying to figure out why. And it's actually for similar reasons to The Man with the Golden Gun, in that it looks cheap, and there's just not as much emphasis on action scenes or set pieces. The biggest action scene in this is a boat chase, and that goes on way too long. And I didn't really care for the plot either. He has to investigate a drug kingpin that has mafia ties or something. And they try to include voodoo elements, and it just did not work for me. It just didn't feel like a James Bond film after a while, and you can tell, being Roger Moore's first film, they were clearly not sure where to take the series. I wouldn't really mind, but it's just such a boring movie. James Bond, Roger Moore in this, he's okay. I see why they cast him, because he played Simon Templar on The Saint, which is basically James Bond, but he just seemed off in his first two movies. He seemed off. He didn't feel like James Bond in this. I think part of it was he was dressed in different suits from what James Bond usually wears, and he carries a revolver instead of a Walther PPK. I thought the villains were okay. Yaphet Kotto was good. Didn't get enough screen time, but he was good. There are two scenes, though, that are a huge standout for me. Both of them involve reptiles. There's a snake that a bad guy puts in his apartment, and he uses aftershave. I think it was aftershave. Yeah, he uses aftershave in a cigar. He sprays it burns the snake to death on the carpet. That was actually pretty cool. The best scene in the movie, easily, the crocodile farm. The scene where he's stuck on a little island, surrounded by crocodiles. He was left there by the bad guys. Easily the best scene in the movie. Rest of the movie, honestly, it was just rather boring and forgettable. But, hey, it gave me those two memorable scenes. Gave me those scenes. And the villains, again, not enough screen time, but they're at least memorable. Other than that, though, this one was really disappointing. Moonraker. Do I have to explain? Do I have to explain? Like, Bond in space. That's all I have to say, really. That's all I have to say. Again, I don't care for the silliness of the Roger Moore ones. But the reason this one's not at the bottom is because I can at least see where the money went. Tons of locations. Tons of action set pieces, you know. Not a huge fan of this one. I just can't. I can't stand the silly, campy tone of the Roger Moore ones, you know. But like I said, at least this one went all out with it, you know, with the money and the budget and stuff. But I don't have much interest in seeing it again, you know. The villain, just generic take over the world villain, you know. Gets like maybe a few cool, like sort of dryly humorous lines, but other than that, I just.
At least I shall have the pleasure of putting you out of my misery.
The opening is pretty cool, you know, with them jumping out of the plane. That's actually, I'll admit, that's impressive. Impressive stunt work. You know, basically, the reason this is above those other ones is I can tell where the money went. It's at least memorable. It's at least got some interesting parts, you know. Jaws is memorable. Bit buffoonish in this, but he's at least memorable. The sets are very impressive, you know, like I said, you can tell they put a lot of money into this. I don't feel like I have to explain with this one. I don't, you know. Did a review of it already. Next. Dino Day. Again, I don't have to explain. I don't. It's incredibly stupid. I mean, it has invisible cars, for fuck's sake. Tons of lasers. Horrible one-liners. Terrible CGI. The only reason it's not at the very bottom, even though it probably should be, used to be my least favorite. For a while it was. It's at least kind of entertaining in parts. With most of those other ones, it was just boring. Boring, boring, boring. This one at least moved at a fast pace. And I'll admit, the first half is actually not bad. I think the plot of James Bond being captured and tortured, you know, interesting in concept. He has to go find somebody that's betrayed him. That's interesting. And the opening action scene, I like. But the film really goes downhill once the laser satellite is introduced and just becomes completely over the top. Another reason this one's not lower is because Brosnan is really good in this. Pierce Brosnan, I think, was an excellent James Bond, but his last two films were just not as good, you know, this one especially. It feels like they were trying to catch up with the 2000s action movies by adding too much CGI in this, and it just looks ridiculous. It's like they were trying to be hip and cool, like, and it just becomes really embarrassing at points. The villains are ridiculous, you know, Gustav Graves, he's kind of this eccentric billionaire, you know, he invents things and stuff. I kind of like him, but, like, he's memorable at least, but incredibly stupid. Or I love the sword fight between him and Bond, which is great. His death scene is completely ridiculous, just completely ridiculous.
Time to face destiny.
Time to face gravity!
It's dumb. It's a dumb movie. But I'll take that damn Ice Palace over James Bond in Las Vegas any day. I can't defend the movie. I can't. But what I'm saying is I'd rather watch this than some of the other bad ones. You know, even if it is like the complete antithesis of what Bond should be, it's at least bearable for me compared to some of the other ones. Casino Royale, 1967. No, I'm just kidding. The last James Bond film to star Sean Connery. It's okay. It's okay. It has its enjoyable parts, you know. There's some funny scenes with Sean Connery. And I really like the villain in this, Fatima Blush, but it's just it's basically a cheap remake of one of the earlier Connery movies, Thunderball, and it's just kind of forgettable. The action scenes are okay. Sean Connery's at least better in this than he was in Diamonds Are Forever, but it's just kind of a pointless remake for me. Like it's one that didn't really need to be made. Just the only reason they made it was because they could. They knew they could get Sean Connery back. They knew they could make some money off of it, and that's it. I'm not a huge fan of it. I'm not the biggest fan of it. The World Is Not Enough. This film, I'm going to congratulate. For an odd reason. Not because it's a good movie. Not because it's a great movie by any means. But because it is no longer my least favorite James Bond film. Yeah, applause. Go ahead. Applause. Yeah. Go ahead. That film is The World Is Not Enough. The World Is Not Enough is no longer my least favorite James Bond film. This was one of the ones I was dreading the most when I was doing my rewatches. But that being said, it was surprisingly refreshing. After so many Roger Moore films. I like some of the ideas in this, you know, and I especially like the chemistry between Pierce Brosnan and Sophie Marceau as Elektra. That's part of why the movie's watchable for me now. That being said, it's kind of disappointing in a few respects. The action scenes aren't anything special, aside from the opening boat chase, which was cool, but it's just not anything special, at least for me. Don't even get me started on Denise Richards in this. She's horrible, terrible in this. Renard, they built him up well. They gave him an interesting, when they're like introducing who he is, you know, they build him up as like he's this guy that can't feel pain. But they just don't do enough with it, and as a result, he was always a forgettable villain for me. Although, rewatching this, I see more of what they were going for. They were trying to do more of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where they tried to have more character development. They tried to have a legitimate romance in it, which came to a tragic end. Like the difference on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And in that respect, it actually does succeed in some areas. I think the chemistry between Brosnan and Sophie Marceau, you know, Bond and Elektra, I think it's great, actually. I think Brosnan is very good in this. But the problem is there aren't enough great action scenes. Like, the boat chase is good. I also like the scene at the Caviar Factory where there's the helicopters with the like saws on them, razors, like Bond's car gets chopped in half. That was pretty cool, actually. That, I have to admit, was pretty cool. The ski chase was pretty disappointing, though, because, like, the villains, rather than Bond taking them out, they seem to be taken out more just because of how incompetent the villains are, because they just crash into trees and stuff, and that was disappointing. Nowhere close to Our Majesty's Secret Service in terms of the ski chases. This film is mediocre, at least for me right now, but it has a lot of moments that are good. There are some really memorable scenes in this. I especially like the scene where it was Desmond Llewellyn's last scene as Q. I thought was actually a really touching and great exit for like such an iconic character. I was actually really sad during that scene because this was his last movie as Q, because he died not that long after this film came out. I also like that they brought Zukovsky back from Goldeneye, because he's hilarious in this. There's like one scene that just gets me every time.
Who are you? And how did you get in? I'll call security and congratulate them.
That being said, I admire the movie in some ways because they tried to do something different. They tried to go for a more emotional love story like they did with Our Majesty's Secret Service, but the story and the writing is filled with too many ideas that just aren't lived up to their full potential. And I always criticized it for being bland and forgettable. In some aspects, yeah. Some aspects, yeah. It's been mediocre, but it has its moments, and I'll take it any day over the movies below it. But it's more a case of missed opportunity than anything else, but I'll give them credit for trying to be different, even if some of it didn't pay off. But I can see this one growing on me. Actually, I can see this one growing on me. The other one's not really, but I can see this one growing on me. Like, I could see myself maybe putting it a bit higher.